All right, well, we're going to wrap up this series called Redemption. It's the story of Ruth. The story of Ruth. We're going to wrap this up today. On Friday, I took my son, who's 6, fishing. We went down to Montauk State Park. And I don't know if you've ever been trout fishing or fishing at all. You might be surprised, but I grew up fishing a ton. A boy from Oklahoma, ponds, I enjoy fishing. And so I love being able to take my son fishing. And so we went down there to go. And this is the interesting thing about fishing, if you've never done it, or even if you have, you never know what's going to happen. Right? That's the whole idea. You throw something in the water just hoping to catch something, but you never know. You can't see it. The future is definitely undetermined. But you throw it out over and over hoping to catch something. We had a pretty good day, and we caught a few fish. And then Cade caught one completely on his own. Don't show the picture yet, but as we're fishing, I'm in the river in my waders. Cade's on the bank, and he's casting out. And it was kind of the boy who cried wolf every cast. I got one, and I would turn around, and he wouldn't have one. He'd be hung up or just playing around. And so he kept saying this over and over and over. And I'd play the game, and he'd laugh. Until eventually he said, "Dad, my line keeps wiggling." And so I look at his pole, and it's not moving much. And I'm thinking, okay, I don't really think he's got something. He's just joking. And I look back over, and he has caught something. And so here's the fish of Cade's catch. Now, don't let the picture fool you. The images in this picture are larger than they seem. Actually, this fish that Cade caught was about this big, all right? About this big. I don't know how he even went after the worm, which is about the same size. But we celebrated, and no one knows what this little fish is. If you know afterwards, come tell me. I show this to several people that fish a lot, and it's a little creature. It looks like a little alien. But Cade loved the fact that he cast it out and he caught something. But you never know. It was the only thing he caught. But he cast it over and over and over. But the deal is when you're doing this, you have no idea what the future is going to look like. You have no idea what's going to happen. And as we've gone through this story of Ruth, this has been where she's at. Ruth, Naomi, those involved, they don't know what their future looks like. It's kind of one day at a time, one step at a time as they figure all of this out. And what we know is true in the midst of an unknown future, and you've been there. There's been difficulties, there's been things that come up, and you don't know what tomorrow is going to look like. You don't know what your marriage is going to look like. You don't know how your kids are going to turn out. You don't know. And there's fear, and there's worry, and there's anxiety in the midst of all that. Just like it would have been for Naomi and for Ruth. But what I hope you have got over the last several weeks is that in the midst of not knowing, we can believe that God is with us. That God is with us. That he is for us. That he's working on our behalf. Even when we don't see it. Even when we fail to believe it. When we doubt it. That he's with us. And so, we're going to wrap this up. And you've missed a little bit. And so, I want to catch you up. Some of you, this is your first time with us in this series. Some of you have heard this every week. And I hope it gets to the point where you could tell this story. Because I think this is one of those stories that we find in the scriptures that it's easy for us to tell someone. It's the story, really, of the gospel, of the good news of Jesus, wrapped up into the story in the Old Testament. And so I hope, in telling this every week, that you're catching it. And so I want to quickly paraphrase what's been going on. So we have Naomi, who is married to a man named Elimelech. And they live in Bethlehem, which means the house of bread. But at this point, they find themselves without any bread. And this famine has hit the land. And this is an area where God had always provided for his people. When the famines had come, when there was a need, God would come through. But for some reason, Elimelech doesn't believe that. There's a famine and he needs to provide for his family. And so instead of staying there, he takes his wife Naomi and his 2 boys and they go about 40 miles to Moab. And Moab, the Moabites and the Israelites don't get along. They don't like each other. There's been oppression. There's been horrible things that have happened. Yet, Elimelech decides to leave the promised land, to leave his people and go into Moab. They aren't there long and Elimelech dies. And Elimelech leaves his wife, Ruth, as a widow in a foreign land with 2 boys. The 2 boys meet girls, Moabite women, and marry them. And then about 10 years later, they die. And now Ruth has heard, or Naomi has heard, that Bethlehem now has food. And so Naomi's going to make her way back. And on making her way back, she decides to tell her 2 daughter-in-laws to stay in Moab. It's going to be better for them if they stay there. They're going to find husbands. She's not going to be able to provide a husband. They're never going to have children. It's better for them to stay there. And Orpah, one of the daughter-in-laws, she stays. But Ruth goes, and Ruth makes this line, and maybe you've heard it, maybe you haven't, but Ruth 1:16, where Ruth says, no, I'm not staying, I'm going with you, and your people are going to be my people, and your God is going to be my God. And in that moment, what Ruth is saying is, the gods that I've always known, the gods that I've always followed, I'm abandoning them. I'm leaving them behind, and I'm going after the one true God that I've heard you talk about, that I heard my husband speak about, the one that you have run from in a way, and the one you didn't trust, I'm going to begin to trust. And so Ruth says, I'm going with you. Let nothing but death separate us. And so they make their way back into Bethlehem, and once they get into Bethlehem, the people see Naomi coming, and they start to whisper, is that Naomi? She looks like she's aged 20 years over the last 10 years. She doesn't look well. And Naomi hears them talking about her, and her name means pleasant. She says, don't call me Naomi. And I'm far from pleasant. Life has been hard, and God has had it out for me. Call me Mara or bitter. Call me bitter. I'll answer to that. I'm not going to answer to pleasant. And so at this point, they come back, and chapter 1 ends saying that they came back at a time of harvest. So everyone in the community, there's been a famine, but now there's a harvest. Can you imagine the celebration and the joy, the thanksgiving that people have, but yet Naomi comes back empty and bitter in the midst of that. And chapter 1 ends, and then we get into chapter 2, and Ruth says, look, I've heard about your God, and I've heard that there's been something set up for people like us, for the foreigner, for the widow, for the poor, and I've heard that the farmers aren't going to take everything for themselves. They're going to leave a little bit, and so I'm going to go out, and I'm going to find us food. And so she goes out, and she just happens to find herself in the field of a man named Boaz. Now, Boaz is in the clan of Elimelech, which would have been Ruth's father-in-law. She just happens to find herself in the field of Boaz, and Boaz just happens to be there. And this is the beginning of this love story, because Boaz is talking, and off in the distance, he sees Ruth. And everything stops, and he wants to know who that woman is. And he leaves where he's at, and he goes to Ruth. And he says, Ruth, I'm going to take care of you. Don't just get the stuff on the edges of the field. I want you to go with our servant girls in the middle of the field. That is for you, and I want you to stay in my field. I'll take care of you. I'll provide for you. I'll protect you. And then later that day, they have their first date. They have a lunch, and he takes care of Ruth in that moment, so much that Ruth has leftovers to take home to Naomi. And then Boaz says, Ruth, come back. Keep coming back here. Don't go to someone else's field. I'm going to take care of you. And here's 30 pounds of barley. Everyone else, the men who would work that day, would average 1 to 2 pounds, but not you. Not you, Ruth. Take this back to Naomi. And so Ruth walks back. Can you imagine 30 pounds of grain that she's carrying back to Naomi, who has been empty, who has been bitter, and then all of a sudden someone or something's providing for them. She says, where did you find yourself? And Ruth tells her, in Boaz's field. And then this is where Naomi realizes what's happened. That maybe things could turn. Maybe they could turn the corner, and maybe they're not hopeless, because Boaz is a part of the family. We get into chapter 3. This is my favorite part of the book. This is where it gets a little scandalous, right? And Naomi tells Ruth that you need to go to Boaz. You need to wash yourself. You need to put perfume on. You need to change your clothes. And no longer are you going to dress like a widowed woman or a sorrowful woman, but there's opportunity. And so dress yourself as if you're going to a wedding. And when you go, you're going to find out where Boaz lays down. After he's had a good meal and he's had a good drink, you're going to go and you're going to see where he's laid down, and then you're going to uncover his feet. For us, that doesn't seem very scandalous, but in that day, that was pretty scandalous. The kids' ears would be covered. People would be blushing. What is Naomi telling Ruth to do? And Ruth says, I'll do whatever you told me to do. And so Ruth goes and finds Boaz and uncovers his feet, and the wind hits Boaz's feet. And he wakes up and he sees this woman laying at his feet. He questions who it is, and Ruth begins to explain. And then Ruth says, Boaz, would you spread your garment over me? And what Ruth is saying is, Boaz, would you do more than just provide for me food? Would you do more than just protect me, but would you take me in? Would you give me family? Would you help me belong again? And see, earlier in chapter 1, in chapter 2, it talks about Boaz praying, chapter 2, praying to God that he would be the refuge for Ruth, that God would be Ruth's refuge. And Ruth comes and says, I think God wants you to fulfill that prayer. And Boaz says, yes, I'll do it, but there's someone who's closer to you. There's a closer relative, so I need to go check with him first, and if he wants to do it, then that's how it happens. But if not, I'll do it. And once again, Naomi sends Ruth home with, Boaz sends Ruth home with 6 measures of barley to take to Naomi and makes it clear to Ruth to tell Naomi she's not empty. To make sure that Ruth doesn't return empty-handed for Naomi. And once again, there's this line that is weaving through here that in the midst of despair and bitterness and hopelessness, that there is something happening, that God is at work. Okay, so we're going to wrap it up right here. So we're going to be in chapter 4. If you don't own a Bible, there's a red one around you. That's our gift to you. Please take that. If you have a Bible of your own, I would encourage you to get that out, or a smartphone, highlight, circle, take notes. This is going to be the end. And this is where we're going to find out what happens. This is what we've been waiting for. Now, some of you don't know this story, and not to ruin it, but I don't know if you remember the movie Sixth Sense. I don't know if you remember that movie. Remember at the end of the movie when it's over and you're like, oh my goodness, I never imagined it ending that way. They're dead, right? If you haven't seen it, spoiler alert. And so we don't realize what's going on the whole movie till the very end. And so there's going to be something that comes at the end of the story of Ruth that you probably cannot even imagine, that is really going to be what applies it to you and to me. Okay, so here we go. As always, I'm going to read a little bit, and then I'll explain a couple of things. I'm going to try and get quickly through this so we can get to an application part. Verse 1. It says, meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat there. When the kinsman redeemer he had mentioned came along, Boaz said, come over here, my friend, and sit down. So he went over and sat down. Okay, so this kinsman redeemer, we've heard this several times now, and I've explained it a little bit, but it was this idea in their culture and in tradition that there was someone who would look after those who needed some help. But it wasn't just anybody. It had to be a kinsman, so someone who was near to them, a relative, there's the kinsman, and then a redeemer, someone who would make things right. So maybe this was family. So if I became poor and I needed to sell my land and I sold it, hopefully a kinsman redeemer, someone in my family, would come along and buy it back. They'd buy it back. They would redeem the land for my name and for my family. Or if there was someone who had been put in bondage and in slavery, and in that day it was more like the workforce, and they would pull them out. They could redeem them from that. And then what we see here is when specifically a woman would lose her husband, the hope is a kinsman redeemer would come alongside, would marry her, would have children with her, and continue the name. And so we just so happen, once again, the guy who is the nearest relative, the nearest of kin, just happens to walk through the gate when they're there. Verse 2. It says, Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, sit here, and they did so. Then he said to the kinsman redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling a piece of land that belonged to her brother Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line. I will redeem it, he said. Oh, so you're hearing this story and you're like, what is he doing? Like, Boaz is the one that's supposed to do this, not this no-name guy. Right? Why is Boaz suggesting to him to buy the land? Shouldn't he try and talk him out of it? Because now this no-name kinsman redeemer is saying he's going to do it. But Boaz is wise. Verse 5. Then Boaz said, on the day you buy the land from Naomi and from Ruth the Moabitess, you acquire the dead man's widow in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. Oh, by the way, like, not only are you going to get the land, because see, the no-name kinsman redeemer, when he got the land, that's a no-brainer. That benefits him, right? He inherits that. It helps his lineage. His heirs are going to now have that land. So it benefits him completely. There's no sacrifice to him doing this. And then Boaz says, oh, but also with the land, you get this woman named Ruth. And not only is she a woman named Ruth, but she is from Moab. I need to make sure you know that she's from there. And so I don't know if you really would want her. She's a widow. She has nothing, but you get her also. Verse 6, at this, the kinsman redeemer said, then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it. So the man at this point, the no-name kinsman redeemer, is worried about his name. And what's interesting is the author here doesn't never tell us who the guy is. But this is what he's concerned about. He's concerned about his name. He's concerned about his heirs and how this is going to impact them. And if they have children, now he's going to have to split everything up with more people, and he's not willing to sacrifice. He's not willing to give up anything. And so just hit pause for a moment, and I want to make sure that we kind of get this idea that love takes sacrifice. That love takes sacrifice. To really love someone means you give of yourself to them. Not only in marriage, but with children, with your parents, in the workplace. To really say that we love people means that we don't only care about ourselves. That we don't only care about how we're going to look or how it's going to benefit us, but there's often that sacrifice that comes along with it. This is God's love for us. This is God's love for us through Jesus. That Jesus comes with all power and all authority, yet he doesn't come to lift himself up. He doesn't come to become famous for his name. He empties himself. He gives of himself completely. He surrenders everything. And so for you, I'm in some premarital counseling with someone right now, and I'll be doing a few more, but one of the things I always tell my young couples, and any couple that's getting married, is to try and outserve one another. Not so you look good, not so you get something in return, but serve more than the other person serves you. If you're always trying to one-up each other and serve, this is a way that love is lived out. This is a sacrifice of love, is to serve, not expecting anything in return. And so the no-name kinsman redeemer is like, no thanks. No thanks. Verse 7. Now in the earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the kinsman redeemer said to Boaz, buy it yourself. And he removed his sandal. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabitess, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from the town records. Today you are witnesses. Man, this is where we've been waiting for it to go, right? This is what we've been hoping would happen for Ruth. Not only would she'd be provided for, not only would she have protection, but she would be a part of something. That she would find family. And so Ruth has had a lot of names. The Moabitess, the foreigner, the slave, the servant girl, and now she is being given the title wife. Wife. You and I give ourselves names. Other people give us names. You felt like you're a failure or an addict, that you're broken. You maybe go the other way and you call yourself successful or worthy. And so we give ourselves names, but in this moment, Boaz gives a name to Ruth and says, she's my wife, that she belongs, that she's loved. And so for you, I don't know what your view of God is. I don't know if you even have much of one. Maybe church is new to you. Maybe the idea of a God is new to you. But what if we could begin to see God give us a different name? His beloved, the one he cares for, the one he desires to be with, that maybe we could see ourselves belonging, that we could belong to something bigger than ourselves. And this is where Ruth finds herself. She's now deeply loved by Boaz. Verse 11, then the elders and all those at the gate said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah, and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman. May your family be like that of Perez, who Tamar bore to Judah. So I don't have time to get into this too much, but if you were to get into the lineage and the names of these people, there is deep meaning here. That the name, that the Israelite clan, the community was growing through unexpected people. And so these people are praying, would the name continue through this Moabite woman? Not an Israelite, not someone we would expect, but through someone who is often unexpected. May your family increase like that others has in the past. And so I've said this since day one. It doesn't matter where you've been. It doesn't matter what last week or last month. It doesn't matter what your marriages look like. What matters is, what do you believe could happen in the future? What could life look like? Because we've seen where Naomi was, and we've seen where Ruth has been. And this wasn't a quick thing. This wasn't quick. This was a journey that Ruth had been on. But the whole time God is working. And so she is finding herself blessed. And Naomi is finding herself blessed. Verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. Then he went to her. The Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. That didn't take long, right? We see other parts of the story, like a whole chapter about the night and her uncovering Boaz's feet, and then like that, married and baby. And we don't see the Lord talked about a lot in the middle of this story. Right? We don't see the name of God spoken or the direction, but we see his working. But we do see it two times, and one is in Ruth 1, verse 6, where it says, the Lord had visited Bethlehem, and there was now food. And now we see it here, that the Lord enabled her to conceive. Right? This was Naomi's fear, right? If you go with me, I'm never going to be able to provide for you. I'm never going to be able to give you a son. Our name will not be able to continue. It's better if you don't go. But we see right here that the Lord enabled her to conceive. And I think for Ruth in this moment, that the deepest desires that she's had has been met. Her earthly desires to be provided for, to be protected, and to be a part of something has now been met. And we see that the Lord is named in those things. There's nothing on this earth that will fully satisfy you. Nothing. Not a drug, not a drink, not a person, not a job, not money, not a thing. There's nothing that will ultimately give you fully satisfaction and meet the desires that you have. Because you know that once that wears off, you need another and another. And so in this moment, we see that God is at work, and he is meeting the desires of Ruth. Verse 14, the woman said to Naomi, praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth. Hold on. It just switched. The kinsman redeemer was Boaz. But now these people are saying, wait. The kinsman redeemer is now this child. That he's the one who's going to redeem. He's the one that's going to make things right. He's the one that's going to continue on the lineage. Verse 16, it says, then Naomi took the child, laid him in her lap, and cared for him. Now, this is an incredible story, and this would be a great place for it to end, right? Like everything we were expecting, everything we were hoping has now happened. And the story could close right here. The curtain could come down, the credits could roll. The things that Naomi was hoping for to be provided and to be protected and to be a part of something for herself and for Ruth has happened. And the picture could fade out, and Naomi's sitting here with this child. It'd be a great story, but it doesn't end. It's like when you go to the movie and the credits roll, and then after the credits, there's like that hidden scene. My kids found out that happens, and so if we're ever in a movie, we have to sit there the entire time until every credit rolls, right? And so at the end of the credits, there's often something that like points to the future, right? Like a tip that there's going to be another movie, or it wraps something up that happened in the movie. It could be insignificant, but most of the time there's this like clue. There's a hint of what's going to happen, and that's where we find ourselves. So where we find ourselves, verse 17, the women living there said, Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse and the father of David. Now, if you're like me, I didn't grow up in the church, and so often I'd hear these things. I'm like, great, Jesse, David, awesome. Like, I don't know the meaning of that, but there's a deep meaning right here. These aren't just people that get named that come from Obed. This is Jesse and then David, King David. The greatest king ever, the king that says after God's own heart. And then as the Bible often does, if they want to make sure you don't miss it, he then talked some more. It says, verse 18, it says, this then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron. Hezron, the father of Ram. Ram, the father of Amminadab. Amminadab, the father of Nahshon. Nahshon, the father of Salmon. Salmon, the father of Boaz. Boaz, the father of Obed. Obed, the father of Jesse. And Jesse, the father of David. So he goes through it, but this time he doesn't just go through it one by one. He lists this long list of people who get us to David. Now, I didn't grow up watching Star Wars, so I was never a Star Wars fan. So I hear people talking about Star Wars and how great Star Wars is, and I'm like, yeah, okay, I know a few lines, I can quote it, but I've never seen it. And so I've now started watching Star Wars with my children. And so we started like anyone else would have. We started with 4, right? The first one to ever come out. We watched 4, 5, and 6, and then we've now gone back and we've watched 1, and we're going to work our way through it. And I started thinking about this, and I'm thinking about the kind of group that loves Star Wars and how passionate those people are. And then they never got to experience the whole story, right? They die, they pass away, and they don't ever get to see how Anakin chooses the dark side, right? They don't get the whole story, and the early hearers, the original people of this, wouldn't have known what was coming next. They wouldn't have known. It ends with David. Maybe they knew that part of it, but nothing else. And so let's go into the New Testament just for a moment. And let's go to Matthew 1. And there's this genealogy of Jesus, and oftentimes when there's genealogies in the Bible, we can just kind of go through it quickly, and we lose some significance. And so now the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, the story of Jesus starts with a genealogy. Verse 5, this is going to sound very familiar to you. Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. There is deep meaning there. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. So these 2 women who are named, who are not the kind of women you would think that would be named in the lineage of Jesus. Right? Ruth didn't come from the right place. She wasn't the right kind of woman. Yet God redeems her and uses her. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. And then if we were to go to 16, there's all these names that are listed. And then it goes to this in verse 16. And Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. Now, there's so much significance in this. That when we see Naomi bitter and empty, wondering about the future, that God was working and doing things. So much so that Ruth was going to become a part of the lineage of Jesus. That Ruth's name is written in the book when it talks about the birth of Jesus. And this is the kinsman redeemer. Jesus is the kinsman redeemer for you and for me. That the one who would come near, that God doesn't stay up there somewhere, but he comes near to us. So we have the kinsman part, and we have the redeemer, the one who is willing and able, who has the resources to pay the price, to make things right for you and I, because you can never earn it. You can never buy it back. You can never be good enough. You can't look at other people and say, well, at least I'm not like them. We can't come to church enough. We can't give enough volunteer hours to get to the point where we say, well, I'm now in right standing with God. It is only because of Jesus. It is only because he is willing and able to be our kinsman redeemer. Romans 3:24, a guy named Paul, who experienced this redemption story, who hated Christians and killed Christians, and then God gets a hold of his heart, becomes a follower of Jesus. He wrote this. It's going to sound a little different if you're looking in the Red Bible. This is a different translation. It says this: Yet God, with undeserved kindness, declares that we are righteous, or that we've been justified, we've been made right with God, that we are redeemed. Yet God, with undeserved kindness, declares that we are righteous. He did this through Christ Jesus when he freed us from the penalty of our sins. That it's through Jesus that we've been redeemed. That he is our kinsman redeemer. And that he's radically pursuing all people. All people. And we see the story of Jesus doing that. Zacchaeus, the tax collector. We see it with the woman who was caught in adultery. We see it with the religious people. We see it with the disciples who would follow Jesus. Get this. There's a group of disciples who follow Jesus in John. Jesus invites them and says, hey, come follow me. They follow him. And then it says in Luke 2, after Jesus turns water into wine and he performs his first miracle, it says, then the disciples believed. So you have these group of disciples who follow Jesus first without even believing. Because Jesus is pursuing people. He's pursuing you, and he's been pursuing me. And then it's our opportunity to receive it. To receive it. Like Ruth plays a part in this. Boaz is willing, he's offering it, but Ruth in that point could have said, you know what, I'm gonna stay on my own. I think if I work hard enough, if I meet the right people, I could put myself in right standing. I'll continue my name on my own. But she never could. She needed someone else to do that on her behalf, and it's the same with you and I. If you've been around this place long enough, you kind of see how we teach. We'll go into a book of the Bible, and we'll try and look at it. But we do a lot of topical stuff. We talk about worry, and we talk about fear, and we talk about relationships, and talk about marriage and money. We do a lot of topical stuff. All of it coming back to, well, what does Jesus have to say about it? But just hear me say this. All of that fails in comparison to this. All of that is important, and God has something to say about that, and he cares about that stuff, but that is nothing. That is nothing when it comes to your heart and my heart being redeemed by the love of God and us being set right with him, and that we would begin to follow Jesus. And so I don't know if that's ever happened for you. The word that we often use in the church is salvation, or to be saved, to be rescued, to be redeemed. It's a point where you and I come to the realization that we're broken, that we're hurting, that we're lost, and we need someone to act on our behalf, and that we can't do it on our own. So God sends Jesus. And Jesus goes to a cross, and he pays the penalty for our sins, for you and for me. And so some of you have been in the church for a long time. Some of you have grown up, and you've never gotten to a point where you've said, you know what? I don't know if I've ever believed that. That God knew my past, he knew where I had been, he knew my brokenness, and he still loved me. That he still calls me his beloved, he still calls me his child, that he invites me into relationship with him. And so maybe that's you today. Maybe we've came through this story of Ruth, and maybe you've seen yourself weaving in this, and you've seen yourself as hurting and hopeless at times. You've seen yourself bitter. You've seen God seem not to come through, but today maybe you would see that he's been working on your behalf. When you haven't seen it, you haven't known it, that God was with you and he was for you. And so maybe today you receive that grace. That's something you do with God, where you admit that you're broken and that you need Jesus. I promise, those other things that we talk about are impacted because of that. That it's impacted because we are redeemed. And then for those of us who would say, yeah, I've experienced that. I know God has redeemed me. I know God has saved me. I know God has cared for me, that he's put me back in right standing. Then the question is, are you living as if you're redeemed? Do we live in such a way that we live differently because we've experienced the grace and love of Jesus? That when we're in the presence of other people, people think, man, there's something different about them. That why are they hopeful in the midst of despair? Why do they speak loving words to people they don't know? Why do they pray for their sick? Why do they do that? Well, the reason we do that is because we've been redeemed. So what would it look like? What would it look like for us as a church and for you personally to begin to say yes to whatever God asks of you? What would it look like? What would it look like if we got rid of our pride and our selfishness? We got rid of the idea, well, how will that look for me? What if they don't respond how I want them to? What if my name feels affected by it? What if we could push that aside and begin to be obedient to the leading of Jesus? Because I believe that you have no idea the impact you're having on someone else. No idea. I was just thinking, we interviewed some young men and women on Saturday. We're part of a network of churches, and so there's a group of people who want to be pastors who come through and they tell their story, and we talk about theology, and we talk about the church, and they interview, and then we give them a license saying, we affirm that you've been called into ministry. So when I do that every year, I think about my story. And I think about my life, and I think about those times of hopelessness, of despair, when I had no idea who God was. I didn't have the opportunity to grow up in church. I didn't hear the stories of Jesus at a young age. And then Kay Wilson would pick me up on Saturdays with my friend Brad. They would take me to church. And then they would take me to eat after church. And they cared for me. They prayed for me. They gave me my first Bible Easter after the first time I experienced hope. I still have it. It's a student Bible. I don't think they had any idea what they were doing. I mean, they knew what they were doing in the sense they were living out what they had experienced, but I don't think they knew the future. They were just being obedient. They were just doing what God had called them to do. And the way my journey went, and now I stand before you, not any better than you. My story is not any better than yours, but just that God would take that moment as a 14, 15-year-old boy, experiencing hope for the first time. And then in the midst of that, in the midst of all kinds of things that happened in my life, would put me here. That he has redeemed me. Nothing to do with me. Not my good works. I didn't do enough good things. Not my talent, not my money, not my possessions. By God and God alone. Where are you at? Greg's going to come forward. We've been singing this song as our benediction at the end every week during the series. And the words of it are extremely powerful, but I think today even more. Even more. May it be in our lives what we've been talking about. May we experience the redemption of Jesus. May the people around us experience the redemption of Jesus. Would you stand with me as I pray, and then we'll sing this song together.